What explains significant historical accomplishments? Why, for example, did the Renaissance happen? How did it break the 1,000-year hold that the medieval world of Christianity and feudalism had on Europe? What made the Industrial Revolution possible? The Chinese and the Romans achieved impressive things technologically, but nothing on the scale of the Industrial Revolution. Why did it first take place in England and then grow exponentially? What also explains significant historical declines? Why, for example, did the Roman Empire collapse? It's the most powerful civilization of the ancient world. It imploded and became defenseless. And before the Romans, the powerful military empires of the Hittites, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians also collapsed. Is there a common pattern at work? Why did the French Revolution go so horribly wrong, descending into a reign of paranoia, fratricide, and terror? And why, by contrast, did the American Revolution, in many ways fighting the same kind of battles and subject to the same kinds of desperate pressures, not go the same self-destructive route? And how, a century and a half later, could the most educated nation in Europe, Germany, become a Nazi dictatorship? Now, the above questions ask about dramatic historical change, cases of that, for better or worse. We can also ask, though, questions about long periods in which no change, dramatic or otherwise, occurs culturally. You consider the San people of Botswana. For essentially 10,000 years, nothing has been the same. San life is a series of rhythms, patterns, and no deviation for a period longer than the whole span of what we study in Western civilization. And of course, the San people, their period of stasis is dwarfed by that of the Aborigines of Australia, who for 35,000 years have essentially lived the same pattern of life. Why did these cultures not change in one way or another? My lecture today is on philosophy of history. As with philosophy's relations to other disciplines, historians do case studies, philosophers abstract and generalize. As historians, we study individuals and cultures, how they act in their environments, and we come to understand why they did what they did, how they did it, and what impact they have had on the course of human events. As philosophers, we learn our historical lessons and ask, are there broader lessons we can learn from the dramatic rises and falls of cultures or from the static nature of others? Can we identify the primary causes of change at work in all these cases? And then, an even broader abstraction, stepping back from the whole of human history, we can ask, can we discern in history a meaning, a purpose, a direction? And having learned those lessons, we can then, of course, as objectivist philosophers, believing with Francis Bacon that knowledge is power, what can we learn from history to further our cultural mission? Now, philosophers ask three kinds of questions about history. Metaphysical questions are concerned to determine the fundamental causal force operating in history. And since the history in question is human history, an essential part of asking that question is trying to determine how much causal power human beings have in the grand scheme of things. And there are four broad answers to this metaphysical question. There are, of course, divine theories, which will argue that God is the primary causal force. This is a thesis that's prominent in the theologies of Judaism, Islam, Christianity. In the modern world, in particularly strong form in the writings of John Calvin. And the thesis here is that history is the story of God's plan for the universe, and human beings are merely God's tools for achieving his ends. The early Jews, for example, interpreted their enslavement to the Egyptians as divine punishment for not following the letter of divine law. The Black Plague of the 14th century was seen by many Christians as a direct punishment from God for their sins, or as indirectly the work of Satan through his pawns, the Jews. In the 20th century, the late 20th century, those who see AIDS as a punishment for homosexuality are working the same territory. Now, materialist theories, by contrast, will deny the existence or power of a God, and they will hold that physical forces are the primary force in human history. One kind of material theory is biological. Sigmund Freud and sociobiology are prominent representatives of this. They will argue that human history, as with the history of other animal species, is a matter of biological factors working themselves out. Hawks, for example, do what they do because of their biological natures. Bunny rabbits do the different things that bunny rabbits do because of their biological natures. And human beings are just going to be then a more complicated biological story, biological human nature working itself out. World War II, to take a particular example, might be explained on this account as the Germans having especially strong, aggressive, and authoritarian instincts, and that is the underlying cause for that particular fracas. Now, another kind of materialist theory we call the environmental theory, will hold that human history is primarily a matter of humans responding to or being moved about by environmental forces. Some environmentalists, materialists, will emphasize geographical factors such as climate changes, terrain, available resources. Others, in a Marxist vein, will give primacy to economic forces. Marxists, for example, will argue that World War II was caused by the imperialist economic nature of the European nations, and more particularly the economic rivalry the Germans had with the Jews. Others in the modern world more recently will single out technology, for example, as an environmental force, imbue it with a life of its own, and argue that human history is now a matter of technological forces taking us where they will. Now, the fourth kind of theory is a volitional theory, and objectivism is an example of a volitional theory. And it holds that human choices and purposes are a primary causal force in history. Volitional theories will usually grant that biological and environmental factors are important influences on human affairs, but they will hold that over and above these influences, human choices determine the course of human affairs. To take a very small scale, I am holding up a pen right, in my hand. What explains this minor historical event, right? Well, I can decide to hold it up, or I can decide to let it fall. I'm going to decide to hold it up for the next little while just to illustrate a point. Right? Now, of course, biological factors are crucial. I must have a neural muscular system in place that enables me to hold the pen up against the forces of gravity. Environmental factors are also crucial. If I'm going to hold up a pen, there must actually be a pen in the environment that is a resource that I can hold up. Environmental factors can also be important influences in other ways by providing incentives and distractions. You might, for example, offer me $1,000 if I can continue to hold the pen up for another 5 minutes, and that will factor into my decision here. Or an attractive woman could walk by. I could lose track of what I'm doing and let the pen fall. But volitional theories will argue, in the face of financial and other attractions, I still have the power to concentrate, to focus, and what action I eventually do is then primarily a function of the choice that I make. Of course, biological and environmental factors are important in other ways. They can override totally my choices. I could, for example, suffer in the next few seconds a brain aneurysm, and I could lose all motor control over my body. That would be a significant biological overriding factor. A comet could fall out of the sky and obliterate southwestern Pennsylvania. That would be a significant overriding environmental factor. Right? Okay. So biological and environmental factors can thus limit my scope of action or prevent it altogether. And they also must provide the capacities and the resources that I'm going to use in the course of my life. But what I do with those resources is a matter of choice. That is the primary factor. And my life is then built up out of the choices that I have made. And I choose to put this pen down. So volitional theories then make human choices a primary factor in explaining human action, and thus explain human history as the story of human choices and their existential consequences. Now, in this introductory lecture, given my limited amount of time, I've decided that I am going to focus on only one question within the broad field of philosophy of history, and that is the question of historical causation that I have just sketched some answers to here, and its implications. I am going to set aside other metaphysical questions about history, but let me just indicate what some of them are so you have an idea of the scope of the field as a whole. To the extent that human agency is a factor, we can ask whether it is individual action or collective human action that explains history. Is history moved by individual choices and actions, especially by the choices and actions of great men, such as Julius Caesar, St. Paul, Michelangelo, Adolf Hitler, Thomas Edison, and so forth? Or is history moved by collective action, right? By the Germans as a people, by the spirit of the artistic avant-garde in the 19th century, by the collective will of the Third Estate during the French Revolution? Philosophers of history will also ask whether history has a direction. Is history a story of decline, for example, as Homer, much of Judaism, and Christian theologians see it, a matter of regression from an earlier, better state of human being? Or is history static, neither improving nor declining, as Ecclesiastes and others have seen it, a matter of the same old vanities recurring endlessly with nothing new under the sun? Is history, as modern Whigs have seen it, a story of progress, of mankind slowly breaking the chains of ignorance and superstition, tyranny, and entering a sunlit world of potential and optimism? Or is history as a whole neither regressive, nor progressive, nor static, but cyclical, as Oswald Spengler has argued? A matter of human cultures developing organically through a growth phase, reaching their zenith, and then just as necessarily entering a period of decline into eventual impotence. Or is it the case, if you emphasize volitional factors in a kind of an existentialist mode, that because human beings make choices, history necessarily has no direction, that it can illustrate no patterns, that history then is merely a chronicle of the arbitrary choices that humans have made at different times? Or is it the case, as objectivism argues, that there is no necessary direction to human history, but that nonetheless the consequences of the choices human beings make fall into regular patterns, and that there are accordingly lessons to be learned from the choices that past human beings have made? Those are all metaphysical questions about the nature of history. In addition to those, there are also epistemological questions about the nature of historical evidence, historical explanation, and whether objectivity is possible. I'm not going to talk about those. And then finally, of course, there are value questions about history, which I'm going to presuppose an answer to. What actually is the point, right, of studying history? We often hear that those who do not learn from history are condemned to do something or other. My favorite version of that aphorism is one that one of my history professors told us at the beginning of the semester in order to try to motivate us to study history, and that was that those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it next semester. But of course, the aphorism is exactly right. History is a laboratory filled with thousands of experiments in human living, and knowledge is power. History enables us to learn from experience, not only our own personal experiences, but the vast range of the experiences of other people. That knowledge of what works and does not work, which only history can provide, is invaluable. But I'm going to set aside then all of the other questions about history and just focus on the question of causality. What moves history? 5 theses are going to inform my discussion. Let me say, you should take my outline with a grain of salt. Right? That was a draft of about a month ago, and some stuff has been moved around. Mostly, it's a matter of details being placed. The broad structure, with the exception of the part called lessons, should be the same, but the lessons part, if you find yourself in a state of cognitive dissonance, what I'm saying is not what's on the outline. Section 8, I think it's called Lessons, has been moved. 5 theses will inform my discussion. Thesis 1 is that individuals are the agents, historically, as against any form of collectivism. So we'd argue that no matter how complex cultures and their institutions become, it is always individuals at the heart and soul of everything. Institutions, strictly speaking, do not do anything. It's the individuals who make them up that do things, and that's important. Thesis 2 is that individuals have volition, right, as against any form of determinism. Biological and environmental factors are always necessary parts of explaining the outcome of any action, and sometimes they are sufficient, especially in the case of overriding cases, like comets falling out of the sky. But most human results involve human choices as a necessary factor and, I'm going to argue, the primary factor. Thesis 3 will be that what individuals choose to believe, so they're going to be their beliefs, is a key to explaining human history, as against any theory that gives primacy to will or passion or emotion or instinct. Thesis 4 will be that individuals, among their set of beliefs, individuals' philosophical beliefs are going to be the most predictive and explanatory factor in terms of explaining the long-term consequences of their lives and their cultures. This will be to argue that as important as political, scientific, economic, or artistic ideas are, it's philosophical ideas that are always operative and in the long run have the most cultural power. Thesis 5, well, maybe the most controversial point that I'm going to argue today. That will be that while philosophical beliefs are most powerful, how philosophy works in a culture is highly variable. Cultures generate and disseminate philosophy via a variety of mechanisms. This will be to argue against any socially top-down theory of philosophical causation, which is often prevalent in objectivist discussions of philosophy of history. For example, theories that will liken philosophers to generals at the head of an army or as being like CEOs at the head of a corporation. I'm going to argue that that is sometimes how it works in some cultures, but not always and not today. All right, let's start with the issue about ideas. Why give primacy to ideas? Well, the broadest framework to start any analysis of what goes on in history, I think, involves two components. You have to have individuals in reality. Right? And both components are crucial to explaining any outcome. You have individuals in their environments. Individuals' environments provide the initial source of cognitive data and the raw materials with all of their potentials and limitations. The environment determines what potential resources are available to be used by humans, and it determines what impinging events such as the weather, meteors, disease, and so forth are going to limit the scope of human action. That's always an essential part of the cause. Individuals then engage their environments as observers, thinkers, and actors. Using their minds, individuals acquire knowledge, they set their values, their goals, their incentives, they develop their powers, their capacities, their skills to achieve their values, and then they act in reality. Reality then functions as a selector of success or failure. If an individual's judgments and actions are in accord with reality's features, then the individual's actions will be successful. If not, they will reach failure. And a feedback loop then comes into being. The individual human being interprets reality's feedback, that is, observes again and evaluates the consequences of his actions, and then rethinks and reacts accordingly. So the basic point should be a familiar one, but that outcomes, human actions, are a result of two factors: the individual acting in the environment. Both factors, the individual and the reality, are necessary parts of any explanation. Now, the decisive part of the equation, though, I'm going to argue now, is what goes on the human side of the equation here. Human beings are rational animals, and this marks a decisive shift in the locus of control from factors external to the human being to factors internal to the human being. And here I'm going to borrow a point from historian Alan Kors, whom some of you are familiar with, where you can contrast the history of human beings with the history of any other animal species that you would compare to, imagine, I'm going to pick the wildebeest for some strange reason. Humans and wildebeests can share the exact same environment. They can both have the same general biological needs, reproduction, nutrition, and so forth. But human history, in contrast to wildebeest history, will exhibit a range of activities, a depth of activities, the complexity of which far outstrips what goes on in wildebeest history. The reality factors are the same for wildebeests and human beings. Both live in the same general environment, both have the same general biological needs. The difference between wildebeest history and human history is what can go on in the human mind. So here I'm rejecting materialism, which has the effect of making material factors the decisive factors in explaining outcomes, diminishing the role of human beings to being a function through which biological and other environmental factors work. So consider a thought experiment, just to illustrate this point here. Suppose we take the standard individual living on a desert island, and lo and behold, we find that he makes a living by fishing and that he supplements his diet with coconuts. Aha, says materialism. The explanation is obvious. Material factors here, the presence of lots of fish in the sea, and coconut trees explains this individual's mode of living. Those are a sufficient explanation for the individual's lifestyle. But making a living by fishing or eating coconuts is not a result forced by the material factors. Right? A number of results are compatible with those factors. The individual must discover how to get to the fish, must discover that fish are a source of nutrition, must discover how to catch the fish, and that requires thought. Absent volitional thought, nothing is going to happen except eventual death. And given thought, lots of thoughts are possible, given the same material factors. An individual learning to fish could accidentally fall into the water, get water in his lungs, be traumatized by the experience, and decide that water is too dangerous to mess with. Coconuts are hard to open, and an individual could simply fail to figure out how to open them. Or he could simply not realize the nutritional power of coconuts, instead focus on their potential entertainment value, and end up inventing the game of coconut bowling. Or a bird could fall out of the sky. He could interpret it as a sign from God and decide that on matters of food, God will provide, and decide never to deal with fish or coconuts again. The point is that for even in the very simple case of an individual making a living from fishing and coconuts, the material presence of the fish and the coconuts are at best only necessary factors. The decisive factor is what goes on in the human mind. Now, what goes on in the human mind is abstract thinking. And so the ideas that are the tools and fruits of thinking have enormous power. Here I'm working my way up now to philosophical ideas. The function of abstract ideas and principles is, of course, to be top-down sources of information about new cases. When they're automated, ideas function as time and effort savers, enabling us to identify new instances very quickly and to bring to bear upon the new instance a whole wealth of background knowledge. The more abstract the idea, the broader its scope, and the more potential power that idea has. Take a traditional example, the discovery that eating limes prevents scurvy. This is useful, abstract knowledge, especially to the sailors who suffered from scurvy during long ocean voyages with no access to fresh foods. But if we then go on to discover that limes are part of a more abstract and broader category, citrus fruits, then that opens the possibility that oranges, lemons, and grapefruits are also useful in preventing scurvy. That knowledge that citrus fruits prevent scurvy is an even more powerful piece of knowledge because of its greater breadth, its greater degree of abstraction. The broader the abstraction, the more potential power it has. To take another example, a famous example from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, example in Chapter 1, I believe it is, of the pin factory. Adam Smith observed a pin factory. He was a great observer in that book. He found that if you had 10 individuals, each working separately, trying to make pins, and each doing by himself all of the actions that are necessary to make pins, right, making the wire, cutting the wire to end, sharpening one end, putting a head on the other end, buffing it up, packing it, and so forth, all of the jobs. Each individual in a day could make perhaps a dozen pins. So that is to say the total output for 10 individuals would be 120 pins. But Smith discovered those same 10 individuals dividing pin making into specialties could easily make 48,000 pins in a day. That is to say, the division of labor increased their productiveness by a factor of 400. That's a powerful discovery in the case of pin making, abstract way of making pin making. But of course, Smith's intellectual identification of the principle of the division of labor is an even more powerful discovery because it is much broader than simply the case of pin making. The principle applies not only to pin making, but also to shoemaking, to shipbuilding, in fact, to any complicated productive endeavor. So rather than principle or divisions of labor emerging hit and miss in this or that business, people going into business who are now armed with knowledge of Smith's very abstract principle can actively seek out opportunities to divide labor, to specialize, and so to increase productivity. That very abstract principle that Smith then discovered and marketed has enormous power. Now this then brings us to the power of philosophy. Philosophy is the broadest set of abstractions, and it deals with the most long range of principles. What's real and what isn't real? What's valuable and what isn't valuable? How do I know things? When am I mistaken? Philosophical abstractions and principles categorize all of reality, and they provide guides to all of an individual's actions. For example, take the principle that all of material reality is an illusion. That categorizes most of reality and provides a suggestion about how to act with respect to most of reality. The principle, all human beings are scum, also categorizes a huge part of reality and suggests a general course of action with respect to dealing with any and all human beings. Or at the other end of the spectrum, principles such as always take into account all of the evidence in making up one's mind. That principle covers the whole range of an individual's cognitive life. Or the principle, always live your principles with integrity, also covers the whole range of an individual's actions. So the point is, what philosophical principles an individual adopts then are the most predictive of his course of life. Take some clear examples. Take someone who is a Christian Science on matters of medicine versus someone who is a physicalist on many matters of medicine. Those two individuals are going to be on very different trajectories in terms of their medical histories, so to speak. One will deal with all adverse physical symptoms only by prayer. The other person will be open to suggestions about diet, about exercise, in more extreme cases, drugs and surgeries if absolutely necessary. The principle then predicts long-range consequences. We can also see this in the case of someone who adopts the epistemological principle, as many people seem to do, that their gut instincts are infallible and who act accordingly, in contrast to someone who adopts the principle that you always have to take all of the available evidence into account. One is going to deal with stubborn reality's feedback by being even more stubborn in the face and persisting in his course of action. The other will be quicker to modify his beliefs and his actions. So, why, though, should we single out philosophical principles for a priority? They have power, granted, but why not scientific principles, or political principles, or artistic principles, or economic principles, all of which are also enormously broad and abstract? They too can have enormous power. Certainly history exhibits the great impact of those sorts of ideas. So why give a priority then to philosophical ideas? I think there are two reasons. One is that the range of actions covered by all of those other principles, scientific, economic, and so forth, is narrower. Not everything in your life is political. Not everything is scientific or economic or artistic. Philosophical principles, however, are universal. They apply to everything in one's life. The second point is that scientific, economic, artistic, and political ideas presuppose, always, a set of philosophical ideas. For example, the existence of science presupposes a metaphysical belief that nature is real, that nature is causal. It presupposes an epistemological belief that observation and reason are the proper means of knowing reality. And it presupposes an ethical belief that the pursuit of knowledge or scientific knowledge is valuable. Absent these philosophical beliefs, the pursuit of scientific knowledge is not going to happen. It's not going to come into existence. And to the extent that there are prevailing philosophies that are counter to those principles, the very existence of science is going to be threatened. And we can see this in our own time, of course. The two greatest current threats to science don't come from science itself. They come from alien philosophical perspectives, that of the religious right and the postmodern left. In those cases, they're not attacking particular scientific tenets. They are attacking the scientific enterprise as such. It is science's naturalism that's attacked in the case of the religious right. Or it's its commitment to reason that is being attacked by both parties. Right? Or its belief that human beings should try to control nature to their own ends. That is also being attacked by both sides. So that is to say, it is science's underlying metaphysics, its epistemology, and ethics that are at stake. That is to say, it's a philosophical battle that science depends on. Now, none of this, of course, is to deny the obvious huge impact that science has had. Newton, Darwin, Einstein, Watson, and Crick, their cultural power has been enormous. The point just is that none of those discoveries would have been made if there had not been a pro-science philosophy in place. And if that pro-science philosophy disappears, the discoveries will be set aside, in some cases suppressed, and eventually forgotten. Philosophy thus determines how an individual will think and act in his narrower pursuits in science, politics, and so forth. All right, now that is a brief tour of the power of philosophy and the role of philosophy in an individual's life. How does this play out culturally? Let me now direct your attention to the handout, the blue sheet, and talk through what that's all about there. When we introduce other people into the equation, the story becomes complicated in several ways. Okay, politics comes into being when you have social setups. Ethics and epistemology then become more complex. But the role of ideas in society remains fundamentally the same as with the individual with respect to reality. Other people then become part of the reality with which we interact, and we deal with each other socially on the basis of our beliefs about each other. To see this, let's turn to the kinds of social relationships individuals form with each other. Some of them are very short-term, some are longer-term but casual. Some of them, however, become long-term relationships that involve important values, such as raising a family, running a business, adjudicating disputes, and so forth. These latter kinds of social relationships then generate the creation of institutions, and that is what this handout is an abstraction of. The abstraction on the flowchart on the handout illustrates the general pattern of social institution formation. Given a value, whatever the value is that the purpose of forming a social group is, there are two fundamental relations socially that determine how this social dynamic is going to go. One is a cognitive dimension. How do the individuals relate to each other cognitively? Take a number of individuals. Somebody makes a proposal at point 2 here. The question then is, how are the other individuals going to relate to that proposal cognitively? They can essentially accept that person's authority. That happens in many social groups. Or they can make an independent judgment about the proposal and associate then with the person making the proposal on the basis of reason. The other principle is an existential component. When people form groups, they can either come together in social organizations liberally, voluntarily, or the group can be formed by coercion, that is to say, by authority. So, at the heart of any group is going to be a cognitive dimension and an existential dimension. Are the people associating by, in fact, reason or authority, and are they associating by liberal formations or authoritarian relations? Since we have two dimensions, each with two possible values, that leads to actually 4 abstract possibilities. I've just got in the next column at point 4 here. If you take intellectually people associating with each other by reason, and in terms of the action associating with each other liberally, then you get the kind of social system that we want, that we are advocating with its consequent social characteristics. Those kinds of social organizations are going to be dynamic. The reason and the freedom that were part of its formation principle will become habituated. Mistakes will be self-correcting. You're going to find the society becomes fairly complex, and complex divisions of labor are going to emerge. If by contrast you take the other pure form at the other end of the spectrum, if people associate cognitively with a leader in terms of authoritarian grounds by faith and tradition, and that is allied with compulsion or authority, then you get a society that is marked by those two dimensions. And I think theocracies are an example of that as a pure form. Those societies then themselves have consequent characteristics that are fairly static. The passivity and obedience that were initially part of the group's social formation becomes habituated and harder to break out of. Those societies either latch on to very easy truths and stick with them, or they end up in failure because they don't have the ability to correct errors as easily. And by necessity, rather, the social structures have to remain fairly simple. All right, let me give you a couple of examples just to flesh those out. This is highly abstract. Okay. Let's take an example on the bottom end of the flow chart. Suppose you've got a group of individuals, more or less living near a range of hills. One of the individuals announces to the other individuals that there are bad spirits in the hills and that nobody should go up in those hills. Now, the other people haven't really seen the bad spirits in the hills. They actually haven't gone up there in the hills, but they accept the authority of the person who is making this proposal. The belief then that there are bad spirits in the hills becomes an article of faith and then intellectually becomes ingrained in the culture. As time goes on, this will then become solidified existentially. There will be cultural taboos that will develop against going up into the hills. There will be religious rituals that will be developed about placating the evil spirits in the hills. There may be formal guards posted to try to prevent people who might want to go up and check in the hills to see if there are bad spirits or not. So what you then have is, over time, a society that starts with an act of faith in an authority figure, and authoritarian institutions then come to exist to solidify it. If, on the other hand, we start differently, we start with a group of individuals living near the hills, and one of the individuals goes up into the hills and comes back and says, "There's gold in them there hills," tells the other individuals. Right? Well, of course, the other individuals can go into the hills and verify for themselves whether there is gold or not. If they come to verify for themselves that there is gold there, they will then start mounting more formal expeditions. They will start to form voluntary associations, business enterprises. There will be supply chains to supply the people working up there, and so forth. And then over time, what you have is people operating on the principles of reason and liberal interaction, so to speak. All right, so those two simple examples illustrate what this abstraction is all about. So common themes in the formation of social groups. Of course, there are mixes all the way along. We have to come back to those mixes very soon. I want to argue that if you look at the various aspects of this chart, there are historically 4 points that can be made, that I want to make. 3 of them illustrate certain historical constancies, and one of them is a historical variability. First historical constancy has to do with what happens at columns 1 and 2, right? Kind of the pre-social going into the initiative phase. And that is, history shows that there is always leadership socially. There's always some individual or small groups of individuals who take the initiative. Without initiative, nothing happens. But you always have leaders and followers. Now, of course, the leaders and followers can interact by reason, but there's always someone who's cognitively in the lead in that case. Or they can operate according to faith and authority, but then again, you've also got someone always cognitive in the lead. And the same thing can happen. We can decide altogether to go in this direction. I might lead, but you all follow voluntarily, or I can whip out the big gun and say, you will follow me. So the point is, there's always leadership. If we then skip over the middle stuff, which is complex, and go to the end, there are historical lessons that learn about the 2 kinds of resulting social systems. These are, of course, the lessons that we all know very well in this room. Groups that are, in terms of, that are characterized by the top box in column 5. Those ones are much more successful in terms of longevity, education, literacy, general health, prosperity, and so forth. Boxes, social systems that are characterized by what goes on in the bottom box are always failures in the long run in one way, shape, or form. Contemporary data, if you take Roger Donway's Lands of Liberty article each year, you find an almost perfect distribution curve of the societies in the top box at the prosperous end of the scale, and societies that are failures exhibiting the bottom traits here. All right, so those are also philosophical lessons that can be abstracted here. If we go to the middle here, columns 3 and 4, I want to make a couple more, slightly more extended points here. One is that there's always an explicit philosophical justification of those principles of social organization in the society. The society organized on the principle of reason, there's philosophical advocacy of reason. If it's a society organized on the principle of faith and authority, those societies also have sophisticated philosophies that they generate to establish those points. And the same thing holds for the existential components, protecting individuals' rights or arguing that people are obligated to show authority. Philosophy is always operative. And one of the interesting things is that given the power of philosophy, even false philosophies can have enormous power culturally in entrenching the basic principles of social formation. We can argue philosophically that faith and authority and political authoritarianism don't work. But because of the nature of philosophical abstractions, if you have large numbers of people who believe those things, those beliefs empower people. And so this can be dismaying from our perspective. We can look at cultures that are based on wrong philosophies, explicit philosophies. But because people accept those, they have, at least in the short term, a lot of power. If you think of what was going on in the religious warfares of the early modern period, if you think of the Nazi dictatorship, I mean, during the 1930s, completely false philosophy, but because Many Germans accepted it. Those philosophical beliefs empowered people. So this is a constancy in social formation. People always discover in one way, shape, or form the power of philosophical principles, and they make it part of their cultural apparatus. Also, I would argue that these two principles that are illustrated here, how we are going to relate to each other cognitively, how we are going to relate to each other intellectually, or existentially, those principles have great power, and for any culture, how that culture articulates those principles is more predictive of its long-term success than any material factors that are present. I have a whole bunch of examples arguing against materialist interpretation of history. I hope some of this will come up in the question period, because there are many examples where people will try to point out that there are obvious material factors at work here. How is philosophy still operative in this case? But I'll just point out one example to illustrate the point. If you take all of the major civilizations that have ever existed, all of the major cultures, almost all of them have died out eventually. But there is one culture that has outlasted all of them, and that is the Judeo-Christian culture. The Judeo-Christian culture started thousands of years ago in Jerusalem. And if we ask, what has been the power of Jerusalem? How can we say effectively, well, it's not the Assyrians, and it's not the Romans anymore who are guiding Western culture. What made Jerusalem have the power and effect that it still has culturally? Well, Jerusalem was never a military power. It was never an economic power. It was never a center of technological innovation or scientific innovation or political thought in any deep fashion. What you have coming out of Jerusalem is a set of philosophical ideas, a comprehensive philosophical outlook in the world, and that has been you make this case, the most powerful and long-lived cultural force in human history, as an illustration of the power of ideas in contrast to material factors. You can't explain the power of Judeo-Christian thought on material grounds. All right. The fourth point, those are the three constant points. There's always leadership. Faith and authority always fail in the long run, and philosophy counts for more than material factors. The fourth point is the variable point, and this is the one that comes in at kind of the last box, columns 4 and 5. How cultures change, kind of in effect going up and down in that column, from being more liberal to being more authoritarian, or more pro-reason and more faith. How philosophy works to affect social changes is, in my judgment, highly variable, historical. So in explaining how philosophy is generated and disseminated in a culture, I think it depends on what kind of culture you're talking about. Whether you are closer to the top of the column here, or whether you're closer to the bottom of the column here. So what I'm then going to argue is that to explain how philosophy changes cultures, this abstract schema can only take us so far, and we have to, in effect, descend a few levels of abstraction and put a whole bunch of measurements back in. Ayn Rand, in What Can One Do, stated that, I think accurately, philosophy is the wholesaler of human affairs. A wholesale product, we know, can be packaged in many different retail outlets. Just as in individuals, a common philosophy can be applied to many different lifestyles. Socially, the same set of philosophical principles can manifest themselves in many different cultural styles. In a culture, it's not simply enough to say, here are the philosophical principles that are governing the society. There are varying degrees of understanding of those principles. There are varying degrees of commitment to those principles. There are varying degrees of integrity and hypocrisy as people act out their principles. There is conflict with other operative principles in the system, and depending on the kinds of philosophical principles you're talking about, they have varying degrees of power, and people can have varying degrees of competence in putting things into practice. So it's one thing, I think, to say that outcome X is a logical consequence of idea Y, but it's quite another thing to say that necessarily consequence X is going to result from the belief in idea Y. For example, it's one thing to say that Christianity stands for tenets A, B, and C, and that logically applied, they would lead to outcome D. But if we take 1,000 contemporary Americans who consider themselves to be very strong, staunch Christians, and take 1,000 Genevan Christians at the time of John Calvin, who also consider themselves to be very strong Christians. All of them will subscribe to tenets A, B, and C, but the existential outcomes are going to be very different in the case of American Christianity and Calvinist Geneva Christianity. So this means that for the purpose of assessing the role of philosophy in a given culture, we have to put a whole lot of measurements back in. Philosophical principles are always operative, but the transmission mechanism of those philosophical ideas depends on the culture and the particular social structure. I think there are two questions here. The first question is, what is the culture's social transmission route of philosophical ideas, including the role and the connectedness to those social transmission routes of their official professional philosophers, whoever is doing the philosophical work professionally in that culture. So what are the actual in-place social transmission routes? The second question is to look at the consumers of the philosophical product, the average person in the culture. How independent-minded is the average person in that culture? That's another highly variable factor. So I want to answer, or argue rather, those two questions, what the social transmission routes are and how independent-minded or not the average individual is, varies greatly depending on whether you are talking about a liberal culture or whether you are talking about an authoritarian culture. Take the authoritarian cultures. It's clear to see in those that change has to start at the top. It's hard to get anything done in that system. There's little intellectual or action initiative from below. That's because the habits are not there and because the leadership can easily squash any initiative that he doesn't like. So if we're going to have philosophical and cultural change in an authoritarian system, it has to start at the top. You have to change the leadership, and then you have to do a lot of cultural work. And that cultural work initially has to be imposed top-down. You have to teach people how to reason, how to be individualistic. You have to develop those habits in them, and that's a very slow process. Then slowly the people will develop liberal habits of their own, and then the cultural consequences will follow. So in authoritarian systems, how the system works socially, that is to say, top-down, and how the system works cognitively, that is to say, also top-down, are matched. I think it's different in the liberal systems. In liberal systems, how philosophy functions cognitively must be distinguished from how philosophers function socially. Cognitively, of course, philosophy functions top-down. Once you adopt a philosophical principle, the whole point of it is to apply it to the innumerable practical instances that you're going to run across. I think it's tempting, right, in many cases, to try to apply this cognitive top-down function of philosophy to philosophy's social role. And this crops up fairly regularly. Socially, for example, the top-down model will liken philosophers to generals or CEOs. Generals, of course, devise strategies. They communicate them to the colonels, who communicate them to the majors, and so on down the chain of command to the sergeants and the privates who take their orders and apply the principles to the particular. Or in the case of a CEO, the CEO generates the strategy, communicates it to the vice presidents, and so on down to the lower level managers and the workers and so on, and they put the plan actually into practice. Now on this model then, philosophers will devise theories, the broadest set of principles that will be instantiated culturally, and they will pass them on to the intellectual and academic historians, the political scientists, the artists, and they will pass them on to the journalists, the school teachers, and the educated business professionals, and so forth. In the context of educational institutions, which are set up to deal with ideas, the top-down model then holds that institutions of higher education will have greater power than lower institutions. Universities teach, for example, the high school and elementary school teachers, so power starts in the universities. Now, if you put together those two claims, on the one hand, the top-down theories claim about the place of philosophers at the top of the intellectual heap, and the institutional claim about universities then being at the top of the institutional heap. This predicts a result. Cultural change, if we bring it to the American case, cultural change in America will have to start at the philosophy departments at Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford universities. Then and only then, the change will be communicated out in two directions. It will be communicated out to the second-tier universities, and then they will pass it on to their students, and then starting from the philosophers, it will be communicated down to the historians at Harvard and so forth, to the political scientists, to the artists, and so forth. And so then they get passed on to the students in the form of lectures and the stuff that the students read, and then the students take it out into the culture and institutionalize it in their various professions and so forth. Now, without denying the philosophical power and the cultural power I think that philosophy departments at Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford have, I'd like to argue that this is almost never how major cultural change has occurred historically. And that is not necessarily the way it is going on now or the way that it has to go on now. Philosophy ideas do function cognitively in a top-down fashion as strategic principles, but philosophers do not function socially like generals or CEOs, giving orders to underlings via an institutionalized hierarchy. All right, let's start with some historical evidence. That's why we're here today, right? Okay. There are, I think, two historical examples, major ones, that actually support the top-down theory. One is the late medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance. There, I think it's fairly clear to say the Cultural Revolution began with the revolution philosophically in people like Aquinas and the earlier the earliest scholars who were rediscovering classical learning. They won the argument in the universities, and the cultural changes then spread out from the early universities there. The other clear case, I think, of the top-down model working is 19th century Germany, especially early 19th century Germany. There you had a very elitist educational system. Entry into the professions could only be achieved if you went through the universities, and only a small number of people went to the universities. And then, as a major component of university education, philosophy was huge. You couldn't escape it in the early German universities. So I think there are clear cases of the top-down model working not only cognitively, but also socially. There are, however, many counterexamples to the top-down model, examples of philosophy and philosophical change working through very different cultural and social mechanisms. The model, for example, the top-down model, does not fit Enlightenment France. That is to say, France in the 1700s leading up to its revolutions. French colleges and universities at the time are incredibly conservative. The leading philosophes, men such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot, and others, none of them has a university position. Voltaire is exiled from Paris for the center of intellectual action for his whole life, or virtually all of his productive life. Rousseau is a social misfit, spending much of his time in isolation and wandering around Europe making enemies, often sneering at a distance at the established centers of intellectual and social power. Diderot, editor of the Encyclopédie, enormously influential cultural product, made a living as a freelance writer. Like many other Enlightenment figures, including Voltaire, Diderot was imprisoned for his writings. His writings were regularly burned. So the point just is that most of the intellectual work, the original philosophical work, is being done outside of the universities. It's not being communicated through lectures to students. It's being distributed through pamphlets, through books, through the cultural salons. I make the same argument. It doesn't fit colonial America. I don't think it fits America in England in the 1600s from the Elizabethan era through Oliver Cromwell, through the Restoration, and so forth. It's not what's going on in the universities that is driving the cultural change there. All right, got to talk faster now. Explore a little further, put some of the measurements in. I think there are two philosophical functions that can be distinguished. One is the creation of original philosophical work. The other is the dissemination socially of philosophical work. If we turn to other cultural institutions, I think they can be illuminating. If we turn to business, for example, the top-down model doesn't make any sense there institutionally. It's not the case that the original thinking in business is being done at the elite universities, is being communicated to students, and then carried out to the business world. Most of the original business thinking is taking place outside of there. If you think of the dissemination methods rather than the intellectual origination, the dissemination method is also radically different. And what we find from the business world is if you're concerned with getting your product to market, there are radically different models of dissemination that can work. There is, of course, the traditional model is you put your store at a major population center and the customers all troop in, get their product, and take it back out into culture. And that's how you get your product into the culture. But if you think of the example of Sam Walton, for example, that is a very different marketing example. You don't put it in the population centers, you put it out in the rural countryside. If you've got a good product, the people will come to you. Or if you think of the other issue of, do you actually have to have the customers come to your store? Michael Dell's example, success with computers is you don't have to have the people come to your stores. You can deliver it through another mechanism there. So business is, I think, rife with examples of original business thinking and dissemination of business products that don't fit a top-down model. If you think of science as a cultural institution, same thing there. Of course, there's lots of scientific original thinking. You look at the originators, many of them are in universities, Newton, Watson and Crick, and so forth. But much original scientific work is done outside of universities. Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, obviously, and Charles Darwin, and so forth. If you look also at the dissemination methods in science, how do you get the scientific product out to the people? Of course, there are journals, there are academic books and so forth, but there are all kinds of other media that science popularizers and even original scientific thinkers will use. TV, internet, magazines, and so forth. Also, outside of the university, science is filled with models of independent research institutes, some of them nonprofit, some of them funded by business. Those can do original scientific research. It doesn't have to be only in the universities and top down. Take the case of philosophy. Original philosophical work does not have to be done in a university. Lots of major philosophers were. Adam Smith, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre, and so forth. But there's an equally long list of major people who were never university professors. John Locke, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, Voltaire, Rousseau, Hume, Marx, John Stuart Mill, and of course, our favorite, right, Ayn Rand. If you think of delivery mechanisms, of course, there are traditional philosophy delivery mechanisms. You publish in a journal, you lecture to your students, and so forth, but philosophy also has its own examples of people using non-traditional methods, coffee houses, salons, pamphlets, fiction, Sartre's influence, Ayn Rand's influence, and so forth. Again, a very different method here. Now, we might ask, is philosophy different? We might say, philosophy is very abstract, it's very difficult to master, it's time-consuming, and so it's unlike science or business. Well, I think you can actually get to the front ranks of philosophical research faster than you can get to the front ranks of scientific research. I think if you take any generally educated person, you can get to the front ranks of what's going on in ethics within a year or so. I don't think you can make the same claim. Take a generally educated person, get that person up to speed at the front ranks of biochemical research or nuclear physics or whatever. So in a way, philosophy is easier here. We might argue that philosophy now is much more professionalized, that the philosophers are academic and there's all of that institutional inertia that's in place. Well, I think science here is another counterexample. Science, of course, is incredibly professionalized, but there are lots of independent scientific research institutes and so forth going on. So the point is that I think all of the above indicates that in deciding where to do original philosophy and seeking out leverage points for the dissemination of philosophy and designing institutions for that purpose, I think we need a lot more empirical research about how things actually work in American culture. Where are people learning their philosophy and who's doing the teaching? Right? I don't think we should assume the top-down model that it all comes out of Harvard and so forth. I think David's lectures, such as the State of the Culture lectures, are good examples. We need to do more sociology, right, of what's going on in America. Take particular themes, reason, tribalism, individualism, faith, and so forth, and do the studies. See what trends are actually going on. Where are these ideas coming from? How are they being culturally instantiated, and so forth. Along with generating those kinds of studies, when we're strategizing about the place of philosophy in American culture and how to work more objectivism into the mix, I want to propose that we just follow a fairly standard business model in organizing our thinking. Right? Of course, first, you have to generate a quality product. Right? And I think we've got one. We have, it needs development in many respects, but I don't think that the development has to start at the top. I don't think we first should mount our strategy on, we've got to get into Harvard and then work our way through. That would be great if we got into Harvard, But universities, of course, are designed to be generators of new ideas and so forth, but it doesn't have to be there. Look for other opportunities and so forth. Second, we have to know, business lesson, we have to know your consumers' needs and your consumers' capacities. Here, I would like to highlight one point. I think historically we are in a unique situation. In terms of our consumers, the average American, we have an educated batch of citizens on an unprecedented scale historically. They're literate, they have incredible media access, book sales, TV, radio, internet, the kinds of products, intellectual products people consume show a very literate, active-minded group. These are not the same customers as serfs sitting in a medieval church. They're not the same customers as people who are sitting, learning in Germany in 1810 and so forth. We have a different kind of people. I think the point is that many Americans can do significant philosophical work on their own, okay, if you just provide them the kinds of resources and so forth. It doesn't have to be as top-down. A lot of it can be bottom-up, and I think a lot of Americans have pretty good BS detectors for pronouncements that are coming down from on high, and that's something that is very helpful. Third, business people will tell us we need to tailor our product to different markets. We can say there are generic transportation needs, but of course Ford makes a Lincoln, it also makes a Taurus, and it also makes an Escort. We need to do the same thing philosophically. Of course, we have to have the Cadillacs, right, of philosophy, right, the top rank philosophy that can upstand against whatever's going on in Harvard and so forth. But we also need philosophy at the systematic levels and the introductory levels. So we've got to work those things out as well. Next business point is, of course, you have to entice your consumer with lots of marketing, lots of advertising, fields wide open. Okay. I think what we need to do is draw on the best lessons from professional marketers that we possibly can in dealing with our particular product. How do we sell the importance of philosophy? How do we sell the importance of our particular philosophy in particular? And fifth, delivering the product to the consumer, actually getting it out the door and into their house. I just hope the models of Sam Walton and Michael Dell should spur some independent thinking, some original thinking. It always happens outside the box. And of course, you have to hammer and rehammer the point. You can't just make the argument once. The advertising has to be an ongoing cycle and so forth. Now, we might argue that we have kind of special liabilities that we face, right, as objectivists trying to sell our product. We can say that philosophy is not like Windows 2000. Right? It takes a whole lot longer to learn. It's much more abstract. People don't have time. We can point out that we face lots of competition from established religion, leftist philosophy, skeptics, and subjectivists. We can point out that we are, of course, as objectivists, plagued with this infighting that is characteristic to most intellectual and creedal movements. Well, I want to say, in fact, so what else is new? Right? Every philosophy in history, right, has had to face the challenge of getting its abstract message across. That's not a new problem. Every philosophy in history has had stiff competition. And every single philosophy of history that amounted to anything was characterized by bitter, bitter infighting. So what else is new? What is new, I think, is our assets. We do have Rand's novels. I think Rand's novels can have a historical, cultural prominence that Milton, Dante, Homer, and so forth have had. We have an amazing product there. There's growing respect for her works. We need to keep that, in fact, that bull market going, right, in the publishing world. We do have thousands and hundreds of thousands of interested readers who are literate, eager to learn more. So something like Robert Bidinato's Atlas Society is a useful tool here. We have lots of smart, very smart, philosophically informed people on a historical scale. We got more people interested in objectivism, right, at the early phases than I think any other philosophy historically. There's a psychological point. I think our being and having the sense of being an underdog is something that can work to our advantage. Business is full of examples of the established view becoming fat and lazy. The upstart entrepreneur, lean, hungry, comes along and kicks butt, so to speak. We are the underdog. So there's an entrepreneurial opportunity for us here. Objectivism, this is to summarize and conclude, is a philosophy that has learned from history and still can. Rand's major in college was, of course, history, and she used that for grist for her mill in her novels and for forming her inductive generalizations. She did great on both counts, but I think there is still lots more to learn here. We need to leverage this knowledge into a knowledge of what can move objectivism into the culture. I may have understated the importance of philosophy departments now in my lecture. I'm open to argument on that. That is an issue of complex social measurement, and that's a very sensitive and difficult subject to do. So let's argue about that. But I do want to leave you with one anecdote to illustrate, in fact, where the lever is to get away from the defeatists. There's an anecdote from business about two shoe salesmen who are sent to visit an economically undeveloped part of Africa. And they go and they do their exploratory mission, and they're going to report their home findings back to the home office. One shoe salesman does his scouting, calls back, "I'm coming home, nobody wears shoes here, it's pointless." Second shoe salesman says, "Send more salesmen. Right? Nobody has shoes yet. There's unlimited potential." We have unlimited possibilities in all areas. Right? The groundwork is laid. We have a great product. We have a large potential customer base. That customer base is well educated, it's wealthy, it's open to argument. We have something they need. For any entrepreneur, it does not get any better than that. All right? And I will close there. Thank you.
What is your view of the so-called great man theory of history and how that works into the issue of volition and the power of individuals? Do you have any thoughts about the relationship?
I have some. What the great man theory has going for it is that it focuses on individuals, and that certainly fits right in. And I do think that obviously not a lot of major cultural work can be done without thousands of people. But it still is crucial to say that people at the heads of various institutions have a disproportionate amount of power. And I think there are also lots of historical examples that some of the great men were not simply people who came up an established hierarchy and then worked within the established hierarchy, but found ways within the established hierarchy to do things that nobody had thought of before. It's like the two different salesmen, so to speak. They both have the same opportunities, but one isn't going to be a great salesman, the other isn't going to be a great salesman. I think also there are historical lessons that show that even when there are established hierarchies in place with long-standing traditions, if someone comes along who is special, and people recognize that person as special, there's lots of discretionary power, and people will very quickly set aside established institutions to make way for the great man. This is not an example we are happy with, but if you take an American example of Franklin Roosevelt, there we did have long-standing traditions, cultural traditions, constitutional provisions, and so forth, but because of partly his charismatic, his personality, but also various crises that people saw that they were in, they were very quickly willing to set things aside. So I think there is something, or a lot, to that model. Einstein counts for more than so forth.
I liked your criticism of the top-down model because I think it's clear that in contemporary American society, the philosophical opinions held by the elites in the university is very different from what most people hold. But my question is, when there is that disconnect, what happens to the philosophical beliefs of the people of the university professors? Are they just sort of ignored by everyone and stand around saying how great they are while everyone else gets on with their life? Or does it seep into society in some other more subtle way?
Both of those can happen. Let me try to perform like a huge inductive generalization here. When you have that disconnect, I think it's clear to say that cases where cultures have done a lot, there has been a match between what goes on in the intellectual elite and the kinds of general philosophy that is espoused by the mass numbers of people. If you think of the intellectual elite in colonial America and the average American at that time, there was a match there. If you think about how successful the Germans were in the 19th century and dragging their culture into the modern world, Even though the philosophy was in many cases more authoritarian and more based on faith, nonetheless, you had the philosophers espousing that view, and the culture accepted that view, and that empowered them. What happens, though, in cases where you have disconnects? Which one is going to prevail? I don't think there's going to be a general lesson that can come out of it. I think it can go either way. It can be that the views of the average person in the street can eventually be eroded by top-down messages working their way into culture through a lot of different routes. I think it can also be, when you have that kind of a disconnect, that the intellectuals can just be marginalized, and the culture can find other ways to generate itself and sustain itself philosophically, and just kind of ignore what's going on at the other levels. So I don't think there's, off the top of my head, one clear answer to your question. All right, thank you.